What's up? I got a short concept video here. It's called When Not to Lead the Turn Even After the Board Pairs. I made this video because there's been a recent trend in poker, which is that after you check and call a bet on the flop and heads up pot, if the turn card pairs the board, a lot of players are leading pretty much their entire range for usually a small bet on the turn. And I'll explain a little bit about why they do this and where it comes from. And it's certainly not always a bad play. It's quite often a good play, but there are going to be times when it's not such a good play, and I'll talk about how to differentiate those. So I've heard this referred to as the range charge or something like that. Not sure exactly where that originates, but it became popular at first in high stakes no limit cash games. I've heard people say that it's been talked about a lot in training videos on other sites. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it because it should be pretty simple to summarize. It's gotten very prevalent in the last few weeks, though. I was just playing the WCoop, and complete random accounts were doing this against me in all sorts of different spots, and I think it's just like a current trend. So the idea is a lead bet after check calling the flop on a turn that pairs the board, helping the caller's range. So I have a classic example here. Middle position opens, big blind defends. So I'm not going to, in most of these examples, I'm not going to worry too much about like specific sizing or stack sizes or even like opening ranges or whatever, because it's just really more of a general concept. Alright, so middle position opens and the big blind defends. Flop is 6-5-2 rainbow, and the big blind checks, and middle position bets and big blind calls. The turn is a 5 and the big blind bets out. And this would often be something like 35% of the pot or something, some sort of a small bet. So let's see why this is happening. The first thing that should occur to us when this 5 comes out is that middle position is very unlikely to have a 5. His opening range is going to be tighter and more high card oriented than the big blind, who is going to have more like small suited connectors and things like that, because he's getting odds on a call and he's closing the action. He doesn't have to worry about a 3-bet, whatever. So he's going to have more 5s anyway. Plus, middle position is going to choose to check back the flop sometimes with a pair of 6s, a pair of 5s, especially a pair of 5s, just to pot control and to have like a deceptive hand to check back that's not ace high or whatever. So between those two factors, we're going to have very few 5s for middle position, and obviously not a huge amount for the big blind either, but significantly more. Right there we know that this is a card that's helping the big blind's range a lot more. The thing is, this bet is not really primarily for a value bet, because we're betting very small, and we're doing it with lots of hands that aren't really going for value. Like big blind, when he has like a 2 or a 6 even, or ace 4 or something, he's not really hoping to get called by a lot of worse hands here. And he's not really bluffing because he doesn't expect a lot of better hands to fold either. I should also mention, if we really just wanted to put pressure with our 5s and get max value, we could do this any number of ways. We could lead a few bluffs and a lot of 5s on the turn for an overbet, or we could just go ahead and let the turn check through, or sometimes check raise the turn if it gets bad, and if the turn checks through, just go ahead and overbet the river. I mean, when you have a situation like this where you have a 5 and they don't, I mean, you have 5s in your range and they don't mostly, there's a lot of different ways you can get value. So we don't necessarily need to do this size. The reason that the big blind is betting here is to protect the rest of his range. So remember, on 6-5-2-5, big blind is going to have a lot of hands like 6-7 or ace 4, which are like quite likely to be the best hand, have some outs to improve. They're pretty good hands, but they're not monsters. And the middle position is going to have a lot of hands that are complete air. And in this case, like on a board like this, complete air is actually 6 outs, almost always. I mean, sure, he's going to have hands like King Jack, and occasionally he'll be up against Jack 6, and his outs aren't live or whatever. But the vast majority of the time, he won't be up against Jack 6, since, Jack 6, even suited, might fold pre-flop. I mean, we didn't specify how big the raise was, or if there's antes or anything. So, for the most part, he's going to have these air hands, and he's not really going to want to bluff on a board like 6-5-2-5, because if the big blind checks and he starts bluffing hands like King Jack, big blind can check raise some of his fives. He can check raise some of his weaker hands like Ace 4 sometimes. He can just call and threaten to check raise rivers, because again he has the 5 in his range, and that just represents it just represents really a spot where middle position doesn't want to put in a lot of money. So if he's going to be checking a lot of these hands like King Jack, if he's checked to, they're air, but they really have like 6 live outs, and a lot of big blind's hands doesn't want him to realize that equity. So basically, he's leading to prevent the middle position from improving on a free river. And so hands like King Jack, when they get bet into on the turn, they pretty much just have to fold. They can't really call a raise, because later streets are just going to be very difficult when you have air and you just can't represent anything or whatever. So really it's more of like a protection lead. And the board pairing part is significant. It's not because, oh, you're doing this when the board pairs because when you have trips you want to get value. The board pair is significant because it means if you check, like if the flop was 6-5-2 and the turn was, whatever, a queen, some card that didn't pair the board, you might want to check with your pair of sixes or your ace 4 or whatever, and it would induce the middle position player to bluff sometimes, and you could successfully snap off a bluff. But here, because the board paired, you're not going to face a lot of bluffs, and middle position is just going to be taking his free card with those 6 outs. And so that's significant. And it's also significant because it's protecting your range. Like if you led on 6-5-2 Jack, well, I mean, I guess you could have 4-3 suited, there's a few 2-pair combos, there's sets or whatever, but middle position could theoretically have those hands too, most of them, and can have aces much more easily, can have a pair of jacks a lot more easily, and so the big blind's range wouldn't be protected, and he wouldn't be able to protect his hands like a pair of sixes or a pair of fives with the threat of re-raising a raise or putting in a lot of money with trips, because there is no trips possible, I mean, besides the pocket pairs. So that's why we do this on a board pairing card, and that's kind of why the play exists. So now that we know why it exists, let's think of why we might not want to do it, even if the card pairs. One reason might be that we check called a bet on the flop, the turn paired a card of the board, and the person who bet into us, our opponent, still has a stronger range than us. He has more of the card that paired than we do. I have an example I'm going to show you guys in just a minute that will illustrate that perfectly, but nonetheless, it should be obvious, like in the 6-5-2 example, sure, the big blind has more fives, but that's not always true that every turn that pairs the board always goes to the big blind. Sometimes the person who opened has more pots. Sometimes we're playing a spot where we check call the flop and we want to lead the turn, but we didn't defend a raise in the big blind. Say we're in a different position, or we limp the small blind, or we raised pre-flop and then check called as the pre-flop raiser, or whatever. There are a lot of reasons why the person who bet might still be at an advantage even on a pairing card. He might just have more of that card for any number of different reasons. So another reason not to do this is because your range doesn't need to be protected. On 6-5-2 you can have a hand like, when turn 5 you can have a hand like a pair of sixes or a pair of twos, and basically every single air hand for your opponent has 6 outs against you. That's not going to be the case on every board. And the third reason is that occasionally rivers are going to be deep and difficult to play because your range becomes capped or you lack board coverage. And if that's going to be the case, leading might protect your hand on the turn, but it might get you in some trouble on the river, where now the pot's bigger and you're not really sure how things are going to play out. And I have an example that will illustrate this too. It's going to be a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to go ahead and get into my first example, which is a hand I played just the other day, yesterday actually, and it's against Phil Galfond actually, and this is in the PokerStars $200 Sunday Second Chance tournament. So let's rewind here. Folds to Phil, who min raises in the cutoff. He is extremely wide to do this. He's raising into, let's see who this is. Yeah, two very tight players, and I've been, not trying to play a ton of big pots with him. Obviously, it's a soft tournament, and he's a very excellent player. And I don't tend to 3-bet a ton out of position from the big blind, so I would expect him to be raising quite wide here, even though he should be aware that I'm going to be defending quite wide as well. And here, getting a little over 4.25 to 1, I'm going to be calling here with a suited queen, pretty standard play. So I check, and he makes a very small continuation bet. Excuse me, and there's really no option for me here but to call. And so here we get a board pairing turn, and this is a situation where a lot of players now, especially some very successful high-profile players, are going to be leading their entire range. And I don't think it's appropriate for me to lead my entire range. It should be a little bit easier to see that, just because I'm not particularly excited to lead this hand. I mean, it's a good hand. It's almost always good. Unless he has an ace, it's quite likely to be good on a board like this. It's relatively high up in my range, but it's not a hand where I'm excited to put lots of money in, and it's not a hand that really needs a lot of protection. And in fact, if you look at my range, you'll see that my range in general really just doesn't benefit from a protection bet here. Consider what his likely air hands are, like hands that have no significant outs to a big hand, and no significant showdown value that would probably just fold to a lead here. Almost none of those hands have two overcards against my range. Clearly, none of his hands have two overcards against an ace or a queen, but actually almost none of his hands have just two overcards against an 8 too. He's going to have hands like, I'm not sure how much King X he's continuation betting, maybe even all of it, since he bet very small. I don't really know what his strategy is, but we're just, he's a great player, and we're just going to try and play well and not try to deduce his exact strategy here. But regardless of how much he's c-betting or what his range is, there just aren't any possible hands that will have two overcards to an 8, except for hands that also have some other draw as well. So he could have, King Jack, King 10, Jack 10, Jack 9, whatever. But King 9 exactly is the only hand that doesn't have like a real nut out that he can hit on the river. So if I'm going to be betting 30% pot here or something, he's probably going to call with the gut shots anyway. And so I'm not really protecting my 8 from anything except for exactly King 9. I mean, sure, I'm protecting myself from hands like, King 2 or something, or if I have an 8, hands like 9-6 or whatever, like 1 overcard hands. But there's not really a lot of 2 overcard hands except for hands that also have a gut shot. So already we're seeing like a protection bet here doesn't necessarily make that much sense. My aces and queens are really not vulnerable at all. Even my 8, it's vulnerable, but it's vulnerable to hands that have like a gut shot or a flush draw or something like that too. So it's going to be hard to fold those hands out without putting in a lot of money with an 8, which is not really something I want to do. The other thing to consider here is that this card doesn't actually help me more than it helps him. Given his small c-bet size and his general tendency to c-bet, and how just extremely wide I am here pre-flop, I mean, Queen 3 suited is not even anywhere near the bottom. I would expect him to probably have any ace on the flop, and that's a lot of aces, ace 2 through ace king, whereas I cannot have any ace here. I also expect him to open any ace, even offsuit, from the cutoff. Given like big antes in play, and it's a $200 tournament, and he's probably the best player in the field, I would just be shocked if he was to fold ace 2 off here pre-flop. So the fact that I would defend ace 2 off, he can have that too. And I don't have the big aces, like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, probably even ace 10, certainly ace 10 suited I would 3-bet here. So I actually have fewer aces than he does, even though I check called the flop. So it's not really a spot where, I mean, he might have like total air more than I do. Like he might have 7-3 of diamonds or something, and I obviously can't have that to get here. But he certainly has like ace combinations that I don't have, and he has way more full houses than I do, since, I mean, ace queen, queens, even eights, like these are all like 3-betting hands, and like even the very strong trips, like I said, ace king, ace jack. So really, I have the capped range here. So it's not really a spot where I want to lead because he can raise, or he doesn't have to be scared on this card at all. If anything, I should be scared. So in that case, like, it's just not the original reasons for making this turn lead, when the board pairs, none of them really apply here at all. And this is just not a good spot to lead. And I think when you see a hand like this, it becomes clear that the way that people are taking this new trend like to an extreme is like, it just doesn't make sense. It's an overgeneralization of what's probably a good concept, but here's an exception. So I check, he bets. I'm obviously quite happy that he bet so small, and I'm going to be calling again here. I might fold a couple of my 8s here, and maybe something like jack 9, whatever. So just basically because he's giving himself over 3-1, I have to defend an appropriate percentage of my range, and any queen is certainly going to be a defend here. And here, river 3, which is a little bit relevant because it's a blocker to ace 3, and I'm going to have ace 8 and ace 3 sometimes, so I want some kind of river check raise range that includes bluffs as well, and this is pretty much going to be exactly it. Queen 8 I'm pretty likely to raise on the flop, so if I get here with queen 8 I might check raise it as a bluff, and queen 3 is certainly going to be like, this is my one combo basically. So I check here, and he goes ahead and checks behind. He had just a busted flush draw. This is not really relevant to the video, but I did think it was interesting because you don't want to check raise any queen here, obviously. If he bets again, it's a tough spot, but with this particular hand, that's the one I'm going to pick to bluff with. So this video is turning out to be quite a bit longer than I had hoped. I'm just going to dive right in here to my second example. This is a live tournament hand. I watched it. I was not involved in it. I had been playing for 14 hours straight before, with only like a couple 5 to 10 minute breaks. So actually a couple 15-minute breaks, and then they changed them to 5. But basically the details of this hand are very fuzzy. I apologize if I get anything wrong. If I get everything wrong, just pretend like this is a hand that I invented to illustrate the concept. So in this hand, Ryan Fee, who's a very good high-stakes cash game player and tournament player, opens in early position, and Brian Rast, another very good high-stakes player, calls in middle position. The flop is King Jack and a low card that I don't remember. Fee checks, and Rast bets and Fee calls, and then the turn is a jack, and Fee bets out on the turn small. I can understand doing this. It's like what we're talking about. Rast probably is not betting like random jack 10 on this board when check 2. He's going to be up against like a few tricky kings, a lot of queens, a lot of air that will just fold that might have bluffed later. So I really just don't expect him to have a naked jack too often. Fee, on the other hand, is going to have quite a few jacks. His default play with any pair of jacks probably on the flop is to check call, occasionally doing something else, but mostly check calls. So we understand this lead. The river comes and it's a low card and it brings a backdoor flush, and Fee bets again. He's probably has some bluffs here, like maybe he's turning a hand like ace queen into a bluff, and he may even be turning a weak hand like queens or something into a bluff. And he's not betting super big, so he doesn't need a ton of bluffs. He's going to have a lot of pair of jacks that he's betting out here with. Unfortunately, it brings a backdoor flush, and Brian Rast raises. And now Fee's in a pretty tough spot, because when he check calls this flop and leads the turn, he can have trips here, but he's going to have way fewer backdoor flush draws that turned, and he's going to have way fewer full houses. The reason being, he's probably not checking bottom set on the flop. He's may occasionally check top set on the flop, but not that often. He's probably almost never checking king jack, and he's probably not checking a lot of backdoor flush draw hands either. If he has a hand like ace x suited with a backdoor flush draw, that's going to be a great continuation bet and pretty miserable as a check call. So this river, all of a sudden, Fee doesn't have the board coverage to have this river go well for him. I mean, Rast could be bluffing here. He could, he's the one with the uncapped range. If he has a hand like ace x with a backdoor flush draw, of course it's going to be a great hand to bluff with when check 2, because he has a great backdoor draw, and doesn't have too much showdown value on a board like this. He can fold out a lot of under pairs. Then he gets let in too small on the turn. He's getting a great price on this draw, and it makes sense for him to raise the river here when he hits a flush. Same with any hand that made a full house, and of course, given his various strong hands he can have, it makes perfect sense that he would be turning some hands into a bluff here. Maybe he has a hand like queen 10. Maybe he has some sort of weak pair that he's turning into a bluff, or even a king. It's just a really good spot for Rast. So this is another reason why you don't always want to make this sort of range charge play, because sometimes the fact that you check call the flop will make your river range vulnerable. And this hand Fee thought for a really long time, and he ended up folding. And I have no idea what he had or what Rast had either, because obviously he didn't show. But I think this should illustrate an example where it may not have been the best to bet the turn. Of course, check calling the turn, you could have the same issue, where you're going to have way fewer flushes and full houses, but there's pot smaller. You don't end up leading out on the river, and the raise, it's just going to be more difficult to get put in a tough spot that way, basically. So this is maybe not the best example, because, like I said, once you check call the flop, you're going to have range problems on a river like this, no matter what. But I think leading the turn probably compounded that. So with that, I'm going to call it a video. If you guys aren't playing with a bunch of people that are leading turns into you when the board pairs, or you aren't doing it yourself, then this video might not be too useful to you, but it's just become so prevalent in my experience in the last few weeks that probably will be useful to most of you. Anyway, thanks for watching.